The gurney hit the locked will stop, and Ethan came off it like a sprung trap. The recovery wing had seen men wake screaming before, had seen Stitches tear and monitors shriek, and orderlies curse under their breath, but this was different. The overhead fluorescence flashed on the chrome rails and on the white bandage wrapped tight around Ethan's side, already stained through with a dull, spreading rust. Antiseptic burned in the air. Rubber soles squeaked on polished tile. One nurse reached for his shoulder out of reflex, and Ethan's arm snapped up so fast her hand froze inches from him. "Don't," he said, the word low and raw, more warning than speech. The orderly at the foot of the bed tried to steady the rails. Ethan kicked once, hard, and the metal frame slammed sideways with a clang that ricocheted down the hallway. A clipboard hit the floor. A plastic cup rolled under a cabinet. For one charged second, every sound in the wing seemed to pull back and wait. He wasn't a large man in the theatrical sense, not the kind who filled space just by standing in it. But injury had done nothing to soften what training had carved into him. His jaw was dark with 2 days of stubble. Sweat slicked his temples. One eye tracked every movement near the bed, every shift of fabric, every hand that came too close. Instinct lived in him like live current. "Sir, we need to examine the wound," a staff physician said, keeping his voice level. Ethan turned his head toward him without relaxing a single muscle. "Then tell them to stay back." Another step in, another attempt to calm him, and this time Ethan ripped the blood pressure cuff from his arm and sent it skidding across the floor. The Velcro crack sounded unnaturally loud. Someone near the doorway muttered, "Jesus." Someone else whispered, "Is he psych?" He heard that too. His breathing changed. Not faster, sharper, as if each breath was being cut to size. The physician lifted a hand for the others to hold position, but the damage was already done. Ethan had read the room. He had seen the cluster, the angle, the silent agreement that bodies would close in around him if he did not comply. The recovery suite assigned to him had a wide window, reinforced glass, and a motorized bed still draped in crisp sheets that smelled faintly of bleach and starch. None of it mattered. To Ethan, the room had narrowed into entry points and threats. He swung his legs over the side of the gurney despite the injury, boots half unlaced, hospital blanket sliding to the floor. The monitor leads pulled taut and popped free one by one with little snapping sounds. "Back up," he said again. The physician did not back up. He tried reason. "You were airlifted in with a deep laceration and blood loss. If we don't back up." The second time, the words carried something colder, the kind of control that made people obey before they decided to. And they did, half a step, maybe less, just enough for him to notice. Ethan planted one hand on the mattress, the other over his bandaged side, and stood. The room reacted the way rooms always do when a man who should not be standing decides he will not stay down. A heart monitor chimed from the next bay. A cartwheel rattled somewhere behind the nurse's station. The physician's expression changed from clinical patience to calculation. This patient was not merely uncooperative. He was now a risk, to himself, to staff, to the fragile order the ward ran on. That was the moment the situation truly changed. Not when Ethan refused help, not when he knocked equipment aside, but when the doctor, glancing at the security button by the wall, made the decision every person in the room understood before he spoke it. "No one approaches him alone," he said. "No physical contact without backup. Put him in the end suite." Flagged the chart. The nurse by the station hesitated only a beat before lifting the red wristband packet from a drawer. Its plastic tore open with a dry little rip. Ethan saw the color, and his mouth tightened. "Try it," he said. Nobody moved to clip it on. Nobody needed to. The order itself had already done its work. In less than a minute, he ceased to be a wounded man in recovery and became something institutional. A problem patient, high risk, handle with caution. The rumor outran the paperwork. It slipped through the half-open medroom door, down past the linen alcove, into the break room where stale coffee sat on a hot plate and somebody was peeling an orange. "Former military," one aide said. "Broke a restraint strap in transport," another added, though no one knew if that was true. "Won't let anyone touch him. Nearly took a nurse's wrist off. Dangerous if startled." By the time Ethan was moved into the end suite under watch, the story had already hardened into legend. The room they gave him was cooler than the hall, the vent humming overhead, The blinds tilted so late afternoon light cut the floor into narrow white bars. He did not lie back when they left. He dragged the visitor chair across the linoleum with a long scraping sound and wedged it beneath the door handle, then stood there for a moment with one palm against his side and the other hanging loose at his thigh, listening. Outside, voices dropped when they passed. Shoes slowed near his door, then kept moving. Through the narrow glass panel, people glanced in and quickly glanced away. A saline kit remained untouched on the counter. Sterile gauze sat sealed in blue paper. The room smelled of iodine, cold air, and the iron edge of old blood. Ethan finally lowered himself onto the bed, not because he trusted the place, but because the shaking in his injured side had begun to pulse with his heartbeat. He kept his back to the wall, kept his eyes on the door. In the chart rack outside, beneath his name, the red marker tab had already been clipped into place. And before the next shift even started, everyone in the recovery wing knew there was one room at the far end of the corridor where a man was bleeding, awake, and untouchable. Fluorescent light hummed above the nurse's station, thin and white against the late-hour dimness of the recovery wing, while the smell of coffee gone bitter sat under the cleaner sting of antiseptic. A clipboard changed hands, a pen tapped once against plastic, and the attending physician kept his voice low as if the walls at the end of the corridor might still be listening. Claire arrived with her badge still catching the overhead glare, new enough to the floor that her shoes had not yet learned where the tiles dipped or which doors groaned before they opened. She took the chart when it was offered, eyes moving first to the red tab clipped beside the patient's name, then to the line that mattered more than all the others. No contact without backup. Down the hall, beyond a strip of polished floor reflecting the night lights and pale bars, Ethan's room sat half-shadowed at the far end like a sealed compartment on a damaged ship. Former military, one of the nurses murmured, folding her arms tighter over her scrub top. He doesn't just pull away. He squares up first. Another gave a short, humorless laugh and rubbed a fading bruise near her wrist. You go in, he tracks every step, like he's waiting for something to breach. Claire said nothing. She flipped through the intake notes, through blood loss numbers, sedation attempts cut short, warnings repeated in different handwriting. What caught her was not the refusal itself, but the pattern around it. Oxygen check refused. Dressing assessment refused. Blood pressure cuff knocked aside before it fully tightened. Contact at the shoulder triggered immediate defensive reaction. Contact announced from the doorway still triggered the same response. Pain alone did not explain anticipation that precise. The doctor watched her reading and mistook her silence for hesitation. You don't have to prove anything on your first night, he said. Observe if you want. If he escalates, you step back. We are not forcing treatment unless he crashes. Claire lifted her eyes toward the long hall. Somewhere down there, metal clicked softly against bed rail, then went still. Did he say much? She asked. Only what he didn't want, the doctor replied. No one touches him. No one comes up behind him. And he keeps sight of the door. That was enough to change the shape of the room in her mind. Not a difficult patient. Not even an angry one. Not in the usual way. A man still behaving as if danger moved on 2 feet and wore a human face. She left the station without asking for an escort. The physician called after her at once, sharper now. I said observe. Claire raised one hand without turning. That's what I'm doing. The corridor cooled as she walked, air venting harder near the end suite, carrying the sharp medicinal smell from fresh gauze and the copper trace of blood not fully cleaned away. She did not push through the door. She stopped outside the threshold where the light from the hall fell across the floor in a narrow gold strip and stayed there long enough for the room's silence to answer her. Ethan was where they had left him, back near the wall, hospital blanket dragged only halfway over his legs, jaw unshaven, one hand braced close to his injured side and the other free. His eyes found her instantly. Not wandering, not groggy, locked. Claire kept both hands visible and left the chart tucked against her thigh. My name is Claire, she said, voice even, not too soft. I'm on this wing tonight. No movement from him except a shallow rise through the ribs. The monitor beside the bed gave a measured, irritated beep. I'm not coming in, she added. I just need to see how you're holding up. His stare cut to her empty hands, then to the hall behind her, then back to her face. Out. The word came rough, scraped dry, but it landed with force. Claire did not answer it by stepping closer. She glanced once around the room instead, taking inventory without making a show of it. Water untouched, call button hanging off the rail, tray shoved too far away to reach without twisting, window blind half open to a black pane of glass. Nothing in place for comfort. Everything arranged around containment. You've got bleeding through the bandage, she said after a beat. I can see it from here. Then you've seen enough. One of the nurses had been right about the way he held a room. Even wounded, even pinned to a mattress by blood loss and caution orders, Ethan spoke like a man used to ending arguments before they reached him. Claire studied the set of his shoulders, the angle of his head, the way his gaze cut not only to movement, but to possible movement. Door, hands, corners, distance. This was not about the wound deciding for him. This was someone living inside a threat that had not ended when the helicopter landed. She took one careful step backward, not forward. The change was small, but his fingers loosened a fraction against the sheet. There it was. Not trust. Something earlier than trust. Space. I'll make you a deal, she said. No one walks in on you from behind that curtain line. No one touches you without telling you first. If you want the room left alone for 10 minutes, you get 10 minutes. Ethan's eyes narrowed, measuring the trap. And what do you get? To come back in 10 minutes and ask one question. The monitor ticked on between them. Farther down the hall, wheels rattled over a threshold, then faded. He looked at her like he wanted to reject the terms on principle alone. But pain had begun to pull a hard shine across his forehead, and the hand near his side had pressed deeper without him seeming to notice. One question, he said at last. Claire nodded once. She reached only for the doorframe, not the room, and gently pulled it in until the opening narrowed but did not close. Enough to cut the traffic glare from the corridor. Enough to let him keep the exit in sight. Then she left. At the station, the physician met her with impatience already loaded in his posture. That was fast. Claire set the chart down and took a fresh cup of saline flushes from a supply bin she had no intention of using yet. He's not fighting treatment, she said. He's fighting surprise. The doctor frowned. Difference. A big one. She glanced toward the end hall again. If someone thinks every hand is a threat, force just proves them right. The older nurse who had warned her earlier shook her head. You think you're the first person to try talking? No, Claire said, picking up a clean pitcher and filling it with ice that cracked bright against the plastic. I think I may be the first one who believes him. That changed the air at the desk. Not because anyone agreed, but because no one had said it that way before. 10 minutes later, she went back carrying only the water pitcher and a folded washcloth, objects too ordinary to look like instruments. She stopped at the same mark on the floor as before. Ethan had not moved much, but the room had. The tray was closer now, dragged inch by inch within reach. He had done that himself. A choice. Proof that beneath the warning, some part of him still intended to stay alive. Claire set the pitcher on a cabinet just inside the door and retreated immediately to the threshold again, leaving the distance intact. One question, she said. Ethan's eyes stayed on her, colder now from the effort of holding himself together. Ask. Claire let the silence settle before she used it. What happens to you? She said. The moment someone gets too close. The room seemed to tighten around the words. Not anger first this time. Not the quick flare she had expected. His gaze shifted past her shoulder as if some other doorway had opened where she could not see it, and his breathing changed, shorter, thinner, each inhale cut before it fully formed. The question had landed somewhere deeper than the wound. He did not answer. He gripped the blanket once, hard enough to pull the fabric into ridges, then forced his hand open again. You're done, he said, but the authority in it had fractured. Claire heard the difference. More importantly, so did he. She did not press him. All right, she said quietly. I'll be the one who comes back. This time he did not tell her to get out. He only watched her leave with a look that had lost none of its danger and gained something worse, recognition. By the time she reached the nurse's station again, the assignment board had already been updated in dry erase marker under the physician's order column. Ethan, primary overnight, Claire. And down the corridor, behind a half-closed door and a strip of cold white light, a man who had rejected every hand on the floor had just met the first person who understood that the wound in his side was not the only thing making him untouchable. The antiseptic smell had settled into the hallway so deeply it seemed baked into the paint, sharp under the colder scent of recycled air, while somewhere beyond the nurse's station a monitor let out a soft, irregular chirp. On the counter, a paper cup of untouched coffee had gone lukewarm beside Ethan's chart, its plastic lid beaded with a thin film of condensation. Claire stood over the file, without opening the door to his suite again. She had learned enough in one encounter to know that charging in with clean hands and practiced reassurance would only make the room smaller for him. Through the narrow glass panel, she could see the edge of the bed, the steel rail, the pale wash of medical light falling across the blanket near his knees. No movement, no call button, no request for pain medication. Just that same shut door and the pressure of a man holding himself together by force. At midnight, when the wing had thinned to the low shuffle of rubber saws and the distant rattle of an ice machine, Claire made her first real decision as his nurse. She asked the aide assigned to the far rooms not to enter unless she called. She moved the rolling vitals cart 6 feet back from his doorway so its metal drawers would not clatter near him. She dimmed the hall light outside his suite by one setting, enough to soften the glare under the door without breaking protocol. Then she wrote a note on the whiteboard just inside the threshold in dark blue marker, large enough to read from the bed. I won't touch you without warning. I won't come closer unless you say yes. Water is on the table to your left. The marker squeaked once in the quiet, and that tiny sound made his shadow shift on the wall. Claire stepped back immediately, palms visible, giving the room back to him before the tension could spike. You don't have to answer me, she said, keeping her voice level, not soft in the false way people used with frightened children, just clear. But if you need something, I'll make it simple. No reply came. Still, after a long moment, the blanket moved near his shoulder. Not much, just enough for her to know he had read every word. She left the door cracked at the same angle as before and changed one more thing. The blood pressure cuff, the thermometer covers, the tape, the saline flushes, anything that would force a rushed reach across his body, she arranged on a tray outside instead of bringing them in. It was a small act, almost invisible, but in a place built on efficiency, it cost time, and time was the one thing every overnight floor guarded like currency. The attending physician passed once, coat off, sleeves rolled, fatigue sitting in the corners of his mouth. He glanced at the untouched chart, then at Claire's station by the door. You're still waiting? He asked. I'm not waiting, Claire said. I'm lowering the threat level. He gave her a look that hovered between doubt and resignation, then moved on without arguing. An hour later, she returned with fresh water and stopped exactly where the tile changed color near the suite entrance, a line of faded blue running across the floor like a border. Your 4 is still running, she said. I'm leaving this here. She set the cup down on the small cabinet just inside the room with a slow, deliberate motion, then backed away before her shadow could cross the bed. The sheets rustled. Ethan's head turned a fraction toward the sound. The hard line of his jaw was visible now, rough with day-old stubble, skin drained of color under the overhead light. One hand lay over his side, not pressing, just guarding. The other had unclenched since she first met him. 2 fingers flexed once against the blanket. Not permission, but not rejection either. Claire took it for what it was, attention. She began building from there, one plain sentence at a time, never asking for history, never asking him to explain himself. At 1:30, I need to check whether the bleeding has soaked through the outer dressing. She let the words sit in the air. If the answer is no, I leave you alone. The room stayed silent except for the low mechanical hum near the wall. If the answer is yes, I tell you exactly what I'm doing before I do it. A long pause followed. Then, from the bed, a voice scraped out dry and low, like it had been dragged over gravel. Leave it. The words were weak, but they were shaped with command, not plea. Claire nodded once, though she knew he could barely see it from where she stood. All right, she said. For now. It was the first thing he had given her freely. Not consent, not trust, but a boundary stated instead of enforced. She respected it. At 1:30, she did not cross the blue line. She documented his refusal, checked the monitor readings from the doorway, and replaced the 4 bag only after telling him each movement before it happened. When she reached for the pole, his shoulders tightened. She stopped. Just the bag, she said. Nothing else. The tension held, then eased by a degree so small most people would have missed it. The clear fluid resumed its slow drip. Somewhere farther down the hall, A patient laughed in his sleep, and a television murmured through a half-shut door. In Ethan's room, the quiet had changed. It was no longer the silence of a trapped animal waiting to strike. It was the silence of someone measuring whether a rule would be broken. Claire kept every one she made. Near 2 in the morning, she slid a sealed packet of crackers and a fresh straw onto the cabinet without a word and turned to go. Behind her, fabric shifted. Nurse. The single word stopped her more effectively than a hand on her arm. She looked back. Ethan had not moved much, but his eyes were open now, fixed on her with that same dangerous alertness, sharpened by exhaustion instead of aggression. "No one comes in here," he said. "Not unless it's you." It was not gratitude. It was not softness. It was a tactical choice from a man still treating the room like contested ground. But it changed everything. Other staff had been kept out by fear. Now they were being kept out by his decision. Claire felt the weight of that shift immediately, because trust, even in a form this brittle, was also a burden. It meant the night would no longer be about surviving his refusal. It would be about whether she could hold the narrow corridor of safety she had built before something. Pain, memory, noise, one wrong move, collapsed it. She reached for the chart at her side, marked the new instruction for staff access, and when she lifted her eyes again, Ethan was still watching her, not with surrender, but with the first hard outline of reliance. Outside his door, the wing remained washed in cold light and disinfectant and the thin electronic pulse of other people suffering. Inside, a man who had made himself unreachable had just redrawn the rules of the room. And before the night was over, those rules would be tested harder than either of them yet understood. The hallway speakers cracked with a burst of static, then released a clipped overhead page from 2 wings over. Metal rattled somewhere beyond the nurse's station, a cart hitting a threshold too hard, and the sound came thin through the recovery corridor's cold white light, like something dropped in an empty loading bay. Inside the end suite, the air stayed dimmer, controlled. The lamp by the recliner turned low, the blinds half shut against the black glass of the windows. Ethan had held the line for nearly 40 minutes without incident. No one entered without warning. No one crossed the invisible boundary near the left side of his bed. The saline pump whispered. Gauze, iodine, and the dry mineral smell of overheated vents sat in the room without changing. Claire remained where she had taught the room to expect her, not at his bedside but off to the right, visible before audible, chart in hand, movements clean and announced. It was the first fragile shape of order the night had managed to build around him. Then the transport aide came too fast. The door opened on a knock that landed almost with the same motion, and the aide pushed in half a step with a fresh linen pack balanced against his hip, his badge lanyard tapping the metal frame. "Just dropping," he began, and that was enough. Ethan's whole body changed before the sentence finished. Not the slow tightening of pain, not the guarded refusal Claire had already learned to read. This was immediate, total, as if some switch behind his eyes had thrown the room somewhere else. He lurched backward and then forward in the same second, hand ripping at the pulse ox clip, leads dragging across the sheet with a plastic snap. The 4 poles shuddered as his shoulder caught it. "Out," Claire said sharply, already moving, but not toward Ethan. Toward the aide. The young man froze, linen still in his arms, face drained. "Now." The aide retreated so quickly the cart wheel barked against the floor outside, but the damage had already spread through the room. Ethan was half off the bed, breath coming ragged, one hand clamped against his side, the other searching blind in the air and then finding the stainless tray table. It screeched across the tile as he shoved it away from him. The monitor alarm began in hard red bursts. He did not seem to hear it as a machine. He heard it as threat. Claire reached the wall panel and killed the overhead chime before it could stack more noise into the room. "Ethan." She kept her voice low and level, not soft enough to sound pitying, not loud enough to challenge him. "Door is clear. No one's coming in." He did not look at her. Sweat had broken cold over his forehead. His jaw was locked so hard a tendon stood out in his neck. The clear dressing near his side had begun to stain through at one edge where the movement had pulled everything too sharply, not a flood, but enough to tell her the wound had been stressed. She stopped 3 feet short of the bed and planted herself there, open hands where he could see them, shoulders squared but lowered. "Your right side is open. I'm not touching you." A crash answered from the hallway as someone outside bumped the abandoned linen cart, and Ethan swung toward the sound with such force the mattress shifted under him. His heel caught the floor tubing. The line snapped free from the pump with a dry click, and the bag swung wild against the pole. For one dangerous second it looked as if he might try to stand. If he did, he would tear the site, split the wound wider, and hit the floor before anyone could stop him without making everything worse. Claire did the one thing none of the others had done all night. She chose the room over the protocol. Back away from the door, she called without taking her eyes off him. The attending physician had appeared in the threshold with 2 staff behind him, all held there by the sound of alarms and impact. Nobody enters. The doctor saw Ethan's stance, saw Claire's position, and after one tight beat, he lifted a hand to stop the others. That small obedience mattered. Ethan was still standing in the wreck of his own lines, but now the doorway did not fill with bodies. No one rushed him. No one advanced. Claire bent just enough to slide the fallen metal water pitcher farther from his feet with the toe of her shoe. "Look at the lamp," she said. Nothing. His chest kept heaving, eyes cutting from the window to the door to the floor as though mapping exits in hostile terrain. Not me. The lamp. The amber pool beside the recliner held steady in the room's dimness, the only warm thing in all that clinical blue-white. One object. Hold there. For a second, maybe less, his eyes hit it. Then another overhead page crackled from the hall speaker, distorted by distance. Ethan flinched so hard his hand went to his side again, and the breath that left him sounded torn. He grabbed the bed rail and drove it with both hands. The lock gave. The rail slammed down with a steel report that ricocheted off the glass and tile and sent the staff outside recoiling. Claire saw the moment pain cut through the panic because his weight faltered after it. The room tipped. He braced, lost leverage, and dropped to one knee beside the bed instead of charging past it. The sheet came with him in a twist. The monitor leads dragged under his forearm. The movement left him exposed, head lowered, one palm flat on the floor, the other pressed hard over the dressing as if he could hold himself together by force alone. Claire did not rush him. She sank, slowly, to the floor as well, keeping the same distance, lowering her profile until they were almost level. Cold from the tile came through the fabric at her knees. "I'm staying here," she said. "No one touches you." Outside. The doctor gave quick instructions in an undertone she could barely hear over the monitor's relentless pulse. The hallway dimmed again after a passing shadow moved away from the glass slit in the door. Ethan's breathing remained broken, but he had stopped searching the room for exits. Now he was listening, trapped between the pain in his side and the fact that she had made the staff retreat. That was new. Blood darkened the edge of the dressing another fraction. Too much movement, too much strain, too long without treatment. The cost of his control had just changed. Claire held his gaze when he finally dragged it to her, and what stood between them no longer looked like reluctance. It looked like a border after an explosion. "If I call the physician in, they will restrain you to protect the wound," she said, every word placed carefully, no threat in it, only consequence. "If I keep them out, then you stay with me and you keep your hands where I can see them." The room went still except for the ticking pump and the distant hum of vents. Ethan's fingers flexed once against the floor, then once over the dressing, his face hard with effort, his breath sawing through clenched teeth. He had asked for rules. The night had just proved rules could fail in a single second. Now Claire offered something harder than comfort and more dangerous than distance, a choice made in the middle of collapse. And on the other side of that choice waited the first true confrontation between them. The antiseptic sting in the air had sharpened under the heat of overworked monitors, and somewhere above the ceiling tiles a vent rattled with a thin metallic shiver. On the floor, a strip of torn tape clung to the polished vinyl beside a fallen floor line, and the room still carried the raw smell of saline, sweat, and fabric dragged too fast across sheets. Claire did not move toward him again. She stood near the foot of the bed with her palms open and visible, while Ethan remained half-braced against the side rail, one hand pressed over the dressing at his ribs, the other spread on the floor, as if he needed proof the ground was still there. The tremor in his forearm had not stopped. Neither had the blood slowly darkening the edge of the gauze. Outside the closed door, the recovery wing had gone unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that forms when an entire staff agrees without speaking to leave one room alone. Claire watched his eyes first, not the wound. The pupils were still too sharp, too fixed, moving across corners, thresholds, shadows. Not like a patient checking a hospital room, but like a man measuring exits he did not trust. "No one comes in," she said, her voice low enough to stay beneath the ticking pump. "Not unless you say so." His jaw tightened. A bead of sweat slid down from his temple into the rough stubble near his cheek, and he swallowed like the motion cost him. "You should have let them sedate me," he said. The words came out scraped raw. Claire tilted her head slightly. "Would that have helped you?" she asked. "Or helped everyone else feel less afraid of you?" The question landed harder than a shouted order would have. Ethan looked up then, and for the first time since the aide had rushed him, his focus locked on her instead of the room. The fluorescent light caught in his eyes and made them look almost colorless. He said nothing. Claire took one slow breath, feeling the chilled air against the back of her neck, then crossed to the counter instead of the bed. She straightened a stainless steel tray with deliberate care, set a clean packet of gauze beside a capped syringe she did not touch, and lowered the volume on the monitor until the beeping became a muted pulse. Every movement was announced before she made it. Every sound was kept small. The room changed around that discipline. Not safe yet, but narrower. Contained. "You think this is about pain," she said, keeping her back half-turned so he wouldn't read it as pressure. "It isn't." His fingers flexed against the floorboards of the vinyl, once. "You don't know what it is." "No," Claire said. "Not yet." She turned then, meeting his stare without advancing. "But pain doesn't make a man track doorways before he tracks his own blood. Pain doesn't make him react to footsteps like they're incoming fire. And pain doesn't make him demand rules unless rules once meant the difference between getting out and not getting out." The room went so still the vent seemed louder. Ethan's shoulders drew tight under the hospital gown. For 1 second his face emptied, every hard line gone cold and blank. And Claire understood she had stepped onto the edge of something guarded far deeper than injury. He pushed himself upright with visible effort, dragging his weight to the side of the bed until he could sit. The motion made the monitor jump. He ignored it. "Get off my case," he said, each word clipped clean. Now. It was the first direct command he had given her that night, and it changed the air between them. Before, he had been defending territory. Now he was trying to remove a witness. Claire heard it. So did he. She did not answer right away. Beyond the glass, somewhere down the hall, wheels squeaked past and faded. Inside the suite, the overhead light cast a pale sheen over the steel railings and the white tile sink, making the room feel colder than it was. "You can fire every other person in this wing from your doorway if you want," she said at last. "You can tell me to leave too." She let that sit, then added, "But don't lie to me and call this control." His nostrils flared. He shifted too fast, and a flash of strain crossed his face before he crushed it flat. The hand over his ribs pressed harder. Fresh red seeped through the edge of the dressing, not enough to spill, enough to prove the cost. Claire saw him register it, saw the calculation that followed. Leave her in the room and risk being seen. Send her out and bleed alone. It was no longer about whether he could fight. It was about what fighting was buying him now. "You don't get to decide what this is," he said. "No," Claire replied. "You do? But I'm not going to pretend you're only afraid of my hands." That hit. Not because it accused him, but because it was precise. Ethan looked past her shoulder, toward the black mirror of the darkened window. The reflection there showed a man built for force, reduced to stillness by a room no larger than a hotel suite. The muscles in his neck tightened. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower. "You keep the room quiet. You keep them out. You don't touch me unless I say it." "What?" Claire held his gaze. The answer he was asking for was larger than anything she could honestly give, and both of them knew it. "Because forcing someone past the point where they can think isn't treatment," she said. "It's just another way of losing them." Something moved in his expression then, small, quickly hidden, but real. Not trust, recognition, maybe, or the shape of an old warning heard in a new voice. He looked down at the torn line on the floor, at the tape stuck to the vinyl, at the wreckage of the last 20 minutes. Then he gave the slightest shake of his head, as if dismissing himself more than her. "You should ask for another patient," he said. Claire took 1 step sideways, not closer, just enough to bring the call button and the chart clipped near the door into her line of sight. Her voice stayed level. "I won't. The decision landed between them with a finality that neither monitor nor hallway noise could soften. Ethan's stare hardened again, but it no longer held the same clean force. Too much had already been said. Too much had already been seen. Claire reached for the chart only after he noticed the motion and did not react. She did not open it in front of him. She only rested her fingers on the edge of the clipboard, feeling the cool plastic and the slight bend of papers inside, while he sat under the fluorescent hum with one hand over his wound and the other gripping the mattress, as if he were bracing against a current only he could feel. Somewhere in those pages, she knew, there had to be a version of him that existed before this room, before the doorways, before the reflex that turned care into threat. And as Ethan watched her hand settle on the file, the first real question of the night shifted away from whether he would let anyone near him at all, and toward what, exactly, he had spent so much strength trying not to remember. The monitor kept a thin green rhythm in the dark, steady 1 second, skittering the next, while the air conditioner pushed out a cold medicinal draft that made the edge of every metal surface feel sharper than it looked. On the counter near the sink, a paper chart lay half open beneath the wash of fluorescent light, one corner lifted by the vent as if the room itself were trying to turn the page. Claire did not touch it at first. She stood with both hands braced on the counter, the sting of antiseptic and stale sweat mixing in the back of her throat, and listened to Ethan's breathing from across the suite. Too shallow when he was still, too quick whenever the hallway made a sound. He had not moved much since the panic episode, but that stillness no longer looked like rest. It looked like a man holding a collapsed wall up by himself. The attending physician had left only a few short notes from intake, and a warning circled twice in blue ink. No sudden approach, no restraint unless life-threatening, minimize staff rotation. Beneath that, buried under medication entries and trauma observations, was a smaller line that made her stop. Former Naval Special Warfare. Prior service-related injury. Hypervigilance severe. Another page had been copied badly. The toner faded at the edges, but one line survived where the rest had nearly ghosted away. Patient responds poorly to unfamiliar rank structure and direct command tone. Claire lowered herself into the chair and read every page twice, hearing behind her the faint drag of fabric each time Ethan adjusted his grip on the mattress. There were almost no personal details. No family listed. No emergency contact beyond a legal office. But in the margin of an old transfer summary, someone had written a note that did not belong in formal charting at all. Just 3 words in cramped handwriting. Used to answer. Not to Mr. Vale. Not to Sergeant. Not to anything on the line below, because that line had been smudged where a thumb had dragged through wet ink years ago. Claire angled the page toward the light. The mark left behind was barely more than a scar on paper, a broken stroke, then 2 clean letters. She did not get the whole name, only the shape of it, enough to know there had once been another way the world called him, and that whatever had been stripped from him in this room had begun long before the hospital bed. When she turned back, Ethan was watching her, not loosely, not with curiosity, but with the locked, hard attention of someone measuring distance and damage. "Put it back," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, but the order came out clean. Claire closed the chart without flinching. "Then tell me what I'm missing." The muscles in his jaw shifted. Outside the door, a cartwheel rattled past, and both of his hands tightened at once, one over the bandaged wound at his side, the other flattening into the mattress as if preparing for impact. "You're done here," he said. "Ask for another assignment." The words landed harder than a threat because they were controlled. No raised voice. No crash. Just a decision delivered like he had already made it for both of them. Claire walked only as far as the middle of the room and stopped where he could see every inch of space between them. The overhead lights gave his skin a drained gray cast, and sweat had dried at his temple in a salt dull line. "No," she said. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "You think being careful makes you different?" "No," Claire said again, quieter this time. "I think you know exactly how careful I've been, and that's why you haven't thrown me out sooner." For the first time since she had taken his case, his silence did not feel empty. It felt aimed. She could hear the low electrical buzz in the light fixture, the muffled hiss from the oxygen panel on the wall, the sound of her own pulse in her ears. "You don't want another nurse," she said. "You want the room empty. You want every door to stay exactly where you left it, every sound announced before it happens, Every person outside your reach unless you choose otherwise. His stare held on hers, unblinking. That isn't stubbornness, Claire said. That's someone waiting for something he already survived once. The line landed between them like a dropped instrument. Ethan pushed himself higher against the bed without meaning to, breath sharpening through his nose. Stop. You're not fighting treatment, Claire said, and now there was steel in her voice too. Not loud, but impossible to mistake. You're fighting whatever comes back when you let your guard slip for even a second. The room changed then, not in any visible way at first, but in the pressure of it. Ethan's fingers curled into the blanket so hard the tendons stood out under his skin. The cold draft moved the privacy curtain an inch, then another. He looked past her shoulder toward the door, toward the square of reinforced glass, toward distances only he could see. I said stop. Claire did not move closer. That was the difference she had learned mattered. She let the space stay his and broke only the lie inside it. If pain was all this was, you would have cursed me out and let me work hours ago. His face went still in the most dangerous way she had seen yet, every expression stripped clean, as if he had sealed himself behind something airtight. When he spoke again, the voice was lower. You don't know a damn thing about me. Not yet, Claire said. But I know this much. You're not afraid I'll hurt you. You're afraid I'll make you remember who did. For a second, even the monitor seemed to hesitate. Ethan's head turned back toward her with a slowness that looked heavier than anger. The color had gone flat along his cheekbones. He did not deny it. He did not confirm it either. But one hand came off the mattress and hovered uselessly in the air, as though his body had forgotten which threat to answer first. The wound in his side, the room around him, or the sentence she had just forced into daylight. Get out, he said, but the order no longer had the same shape. It frayed at the edges. Claire reached for the chart, not to hide what she had found, but to make a choice in front of him. She set it back on the counter, closed, and stepped toward the door. Her shoes whispered against the tile. At the threshold she stopped, the handle cool against her palm, and looked back once through the fluorescent glare and the thin smell of bleach. I can leave, she said. But if I do, the next person walks in blind, and you know what happens when people come at you blind. Ethan's throat moved. The room held. So decide, Claire said. You can keep spending blood and strength fighting shadows, or you can let the one person who isn't cornering you stay long enough to prove what she's for. She opened the door an inch, enough to let in a line of brighter hallway light and the distant squeak of rubber soles, then waited without stepping through. Behind her, the bed frame gave the faintest metal creak. When Ethan answered, it was not permission. Not yet. But it was the first thing he had given her that sounded less like a barricade than a wound. If you think you understand this, he said into the cold, humming room, then tell me what they used to call me. The hallway air carried disinfectant and overworked heat, but inside the suite the temperature dropped a shade cooler, held there by the low vent above the window and the drawn privacy curtain that turned the city light into a dull silver wash. Claire did not step in at once. Her hand stayed on the edge of the door, fingers resting against the brushed metal plate, while Ethan sat half-shadowed against the raised hospital bed, one hand clamped near the dressing at his side, jaw set as if the question had cost him more than the blood already lost. He had thrown it at her like a challenge, but the sound underneath it had not been defiance. It had been risk. Claire let the door ease shut behind her with a soft hydraulic sigh. No rush. No clipboard lifted like a shield. No bright voice pretending this was ordinary. She crossed only as far as the foot of the bed and stopped where he could track every inch of her movement. The monitor gave its muted pulse. Somewhere beyond the wall, a cart rolled past with the faint clink of glass and stainless steel. I think, she said, quiet enough that he had to listen instead of brace, that if I say the wrong thing, you'll shut the last door you left open. Ethan's eyes narrowed, not in confusion but in calculation. A muscle moved once in his cheek. The room held still around him. Claire reached into the outer pocket of her scrub top slowly, 2 fingers first, and drew out the folded copy she had requested an hour earlier from intake storage. Not his full service file, not some miracle answer, only the transfer sheet with older emergency identifiers carried over from a system nobody had cleaned up properly. The paper made a dry sound in the dim room. She did not open it yet. You asked me to tell you what they used to call you, she said. If I do this, I need you to hear one thing first. His hand tightened at his side. You don't get to tell me what I need. No, Claire said, and for the first time there was steel in her voice, clean and visible. But I do get to decide whether I hand you something sharp when you're already bleeding. That made him go very still. Not calmer. Still. The kind of stillness that came before impact. He looked at the paper, then at her face, as if trying to determine whether she was bluffing, whether this was another test, another person using his own history like a pry bar. Claire set the folded sheet down on the overbed table without sliding it closer. She kept both hands where he could see them. I'm not saying it to control you, she said. I'm saying it because you asked, and because I think part of you is tired of being trapped in the second before something happened. The fluorescent spill from the bathroom caught the edge of his profile, the rough line of unshaven skin, the damp strands of hair at his temple. He looked away first, toward the dark window that reflected the room back at them in ghostly layers. Then say it, he muttered. The words came flat, but his shoulders locked hard against the mattress. Claire heard the old strain in the bed frame before she answered. There was no ceremony to it. No dramatic pause stretched for effect. Only one breath, measured and visible in the cooled air near the vent, and then the name spoken exactly once. Reaper. The effect was immediate and strange in its quiet. Ethan did not flinch like a man struck. He stopped like a man who had heard a door open in a house he thought had burned down years ago. His eyes lifted to her so fast it felt almost involuntary, and whatever refusal had been gathering in him broke apart before it reached his mouth. The hand at his wound loosened by a fraction. His chest hitched once, shallow and unfinished. Claire saw recognition land before suspicion could rebuild. Not because she knew everything. She did not. But because she had found the one word that belonged to the man before the hospital, before the suite, before pain had turned every approach into threat. Who told you that? He asked. Gone was the edge he had used on the doctor, on the aides, even on her. This came out lower, scraped raw from someplace unguarded. Claire shook her head once. No one told me. It was buried in a transfer notation tied to an old military emergency contact chain. One line. Nothing else. She let that truth sit between them. No invented expertise. No grand revelation. Just enough to prove she had not guessed. Ethan stared at her as if he were measuring whether the room itself had changed shape. Then he gave the smallest motion toward the chair in the corner. Not a command. Not hospitality. Permission adjusted by habit into something harsher than he meant. Claire took it for what it was. She pulled the chair only a foot closer, the rubber tips whispering against the floor, and sat without reaching for him. Why that one? She asked. He swallowed. The monitor climbed a beat, then another. Because that's who they needed, he said. Because if they said Ethan, it meant there was still a person in the room. The words seemed to surprise him once they were out. He looked down at his own hand, as if he did not remember unclenching it. Claire did not press further. She watched the tremor that had started near his wrist, the way he hid it by curling his fingers into the blanket. Outside, a distant elevator bell chimed and faded. Inside, the room held a different kind of tension now, thinner but more dangerous in its honesty. Ethan dragged in a careful breath and shut his eyes for 1 second too long. When he opened them again, the wall behind them was lower, not gone. If you found that, he said, voice roughened by something deeper than fatigue, then you know enough to leave this alone. Claire leaned forward just slightly, forearms on her knees, keeping the distance he had taught her to keep. No, she said. I know enough to understand that every time someone comes at you without warning, you're not only here. He gave a humorless exhale that barely counted as a laugh. You think a word fixes that? No, she said. I think a word proved you're still in there. Silence gathered, warm near the ceiling, cold near the floor. Ethan looked at the sealed door, then at the untouched call button, then back at Claire. The room no longer belonged entirely to his fear. That was the shift, and both of them knew it. But the cost of it showed in the sheen of sweat along his brow and the way his breathing had turned careful, protective, as though holding the past in place took muscle. At last he moved the blanket aside from his injured side by less than an inch, exposing the edge of the loosened dressing and the dark stain blooming beneath the tape. It was not consent yet. Not fully. It was something more fragile and therefore more costly. An opening that could be withdrawn the second she mishandled it. If you say that name again, he said, eyes fixed on hers, you'd better know what else comes with it. And with that, The power in the room shifted a second time, not back to fear, but forward to truth, waiting to see whether Claire would take the first touch he was finally offering, or the first confession he had just warned her would hurt more. Monitors kept up their thin, patient beeping while the vent above the suite whispered cool air across the dim room, stirring the edge of a paper chart on the counter. The antiseptic smell sat sharp under the warmer scent of clean cotton and dried sweat, and in that narrow pool of amber light beside the bed, Claire did not move closer right away. Ethan was still half raised against the pillows, one hand locked near his side, jaw set hard enough to show the line of strain near his ear. The old name had not vanished from the air yet. It seemed to rest between them like something taken out of storage after years in the dark. Claire let 1 second pass, then another, keeping both hands where he could see them. "Then tell me the rule," she said quietly. No challenge in it. No softness either. Just a clean line offered across open ground. His breathing hitched once before settling into shorter pulls. The blanket had slipped enough to reveal the reinforced tape over his wound, and beneath one edge of it, a fresh stain had spread to the color of rust. He saw her glance there. "You touched the bandage," he said, voice rough from disuse and restraint. "You don't ask me to explain first." Claire gave one small nod. "All right. You don't let anyone else in." "I won't. And if I tell you to stop," his eyes cut to hers, alert and hard despite the exhaustion pulling at his face, "you stop." That was the shift. Not surrender. Terms. His terms. Claire accepted them without bargaining, then turned with precise economy toward the stainless tray she had left prepared earlier, the metal catching a dull strip of light. Gauze packets, saline, fresh tape, gloves. The tiny sounds of plastic opening and wrappers separating seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet. She dragged a stool close, but not too close, the rubber feet murmuring against the floor. When she sat, she stayed below the level of his shoulders, giving him sight lines, giving him room. "I'm going to put on gloves now," she said. "Then I'm going to lift the edge on your left side first." He did not answer, but he did not recoil. The first latex snap was soft, almost apologetic. Claire held her gloved hands in the light for him to see, then extended only one toward the loosened corner of tape. Ethan's whole body tightened before contact happened. The tendons in his neck stood out. His fingers curled against the sheet. Yet he stayed. Claire touched the adhesive with the back of 2 fingers first, light as if testing the temperature of water, and when he flinched, she paused exactly where she was. "Still with me," she said. Not a question, a marker. After a long moment, he gave the smallest nod. She peeled the tape back a fraction of an inch. The smell changed at once, sterile and metallic. A line of pain crossed his face so sharply it seemed to pull the room thinner around him. But he did not strike, did not shove, did not bolt from the bed. Instead, he stared at the far wall where the low light turned the paint the color of storm ash and forced his breathing into countable pieces. For more seconds, Claire said, "Then I clean it." His laugh came dry and humorless. "You always narrate the bad part. Only when I want somebody to stay through it." That nearly got another sound from him. Not quite a laugh this time. Not quite disbelief either. She cleaned the reopened edge with slow efficiency, saline cooling the inflamed skin, gauze drawing away the thin seep that had escaped when the panic episode tore the healing line. The work was intimate in the most clinical way, every motion announced before it happened, every pause left in place long enough for him to choose not to end it. For the first time since arriving in the recovery wing, Ethan let another person tend to the damage without treating the touch as an attack. The room seemed to understand the cost of that before either of them did. Even the monitors felt quieter. Claire replaced the dressing, smoothing the final strip of tape down with deliberate pressure no stronger than necessary. When she finished, she withdrew at once, hands retreating into her own space instead of lingering where trust had just been spent. Ethan looked down at the clean bandage as if it belonged to someone else. Then his shoulders dropped a fraction, not from weakness but from the strange shock of finding the moment over and himself still inside it. Claire stripped off one glove, then the other, dropping them into the waste bin with a soft crackle. "You said there was more that came with that name," she said. The monitor clicked on. Cool air moved again. Ethan rubbed his thumb once against the seam of the blanket, a repetitive motion so controlled it looked trained out of old nights when stillness had been survival. "There was a door team," he said at last, voice flatter now, pulled inward. 3 of us on entry. 1 overwatch. 1 local asset. He stopped, eyes fixed not on Claire but on the dark window where the room reflected back a pale ghost of the bed and the chair beside it. We were fed a route marked clean. The words landed one by one, stripped of drama, which made them heavier. It wasn't clean. Claire said nothing. He had made the opening. She knew enough now not to crowd it. A cart rolled somewhere far down the hall, its wheels rattling over a threshold. Ethan swallowed. I put my hand on a shoulder that night, too, he said, almost to the glass, almost to himself. Thought I was pulling one of mine out of the stack. His hand, the one nearest the healed tape, flexed once and went still again. It was the man who sold us in. Silence filled the gap after that. Not empty, but loaded, like a room after a shot no one could unhear. Claire did not ask how he knew. She did not ask who died. She did not ask whether the betrayal came from the asset or someone above him. She only understood, now in a shape she could work with, why touch had become a lie to his body. Pain was simple. Contact was not. Ethan finally turned his head and looked at her fully, the guarded violence from earlier replaced by something more dangerous because it had no armor on it. I didn't freeze over there, he said. I froze after, when I realized I knew his voice. He'd briefed us before. The confession left a residue in the air heavier than blood or antiseptic. Not just loss. Contamination. Trust poisoned at the source. Claire held his gaze without trying to soothe him out of it. You don't have to finish tonight, she said. His eyes narrowed faintly, measuring whether that was escape or respect. Then he reached for the cup on the tray with his uninjured side, missed it by an inch, and stopped. Not from rage this time. From the tremor that suddenly betrayed how much the last 10 minutes had cost him. Claire saw it, and this time she did not act without permission. Water, she asked. Ethan looked at the cup, then back at her. The pause stretched long enough to matter. Yeah, he said. 1 word. Small. But it required more trust than the bandage had. Claire picked up the cup and held it out within his reach first. When the shake in his hand made the plastic tremble, he let her tip it the last few degrees so he could drink. The contact was nothing, glove gone, fingers nowhere near skin, yet the accommodation itself changed the room more than the wound care had. He was no longer only allowing treatment. He was accepting help. After a sip, then another, he leaned back and closed his eyes for one exhausted second before opening them again. If I start talking, he said, each word measured against whatever remained of his defenses. You keep the doctor out until morning. It was not a request. It was the first hard condition attached to a confession, and in the silence that followed, the night sharpened around Claire's answer. The fluorescent light had gone softer toward dawn, no longer sharp white, but a pale hospital gray that flattened the corners of the suite and turned the stainless steel tray beside the bed into a dull ribbon of reflected cold. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, clean gauze, and the bitter edge of black coffee gone cool in its paper cup. Claire did not answer him right away. She set the cup down, checked the latch on the half-closed door with 2 quiet fingers, and pulled the privacy curtain another inch across the glass panel, not to hide him from the world, but to prove that when she said she would hold the line, she meant it. Only then did she come back within the boundary he had already chosen for her. Ethan watched every movement. The old vigilance was still there in the angle of his jaw and the way his good hand rested close to his side, but it no longer looked like a weapon waiting to fire. It looked like a man measuring whether the ground under him would hold. Until morning, Claire said, her voice low enough that it never seemed to strike the air. No doctor unless your vitals crash or you tell me otherwise. The terms landed between them with the weight of a field agreement, and for the first time since he had entered the recovery wing, he gave a single short nod, as if accepting a rule from someone he did not need to fight. Then he moved first. That was what changed everything. Not her reaching, not the chart, not the call sign. Ethan took the edge of the blanket in his fingers and folded it back from his side by an inch, exposing the fresh dressing she had secured there and the bruised skin around it, yellow and deep red under the low light. The act was small, almost nothing, but it was the opposite of resistance. Claire crossed the remaining distance slowly, the rubber soles of her shoes making almost no sound against the waxed floor, and when she placed her hand against the tape line to check for seepage, he did not flinch. The muscles in his abdomen tightened. His breath hitched once. Still he stayed. The monitor kept its steady rhythm, no longer sprinting, and her fingertips, gloved and careful, lifted one corner, pressed the dressing, then smoothed it down again. He let her. A man who had fought every hand now held still under one. Outside the suite, a cart rattled somewhere far down the corridor, then faded. Inside, the silence belonged to them. It wasn't the mission, Ethan said at last, eyes fixed on the ceiling tile above him as if the words would only come if he didn't have to see where they landed. Not by itself. Claire reached for the blood pressure cuff, gave him a look first, and when he didn't object, wrapped it around his arm with deliberate slowness. Velcro whispered in the room. Then what was it, she asked. The cuff tightened. So did something in his face. The hand after, he said. Not enemy. Ours. Claire said nothing. She did not push for names, did not ask for a full report, did not drag him back through details like wire. She just took the reading, logged it on the chart at the foot of the bed, and came back to adjust the 4-line where it had twisted near his wrist. You reached for help, she said, and the wrong person answered. His laugh was dry and almost soundless, more air than humor. Close enough. He turned his head then, looking at her directly, the first unbroken look he had given her without challenge in it. In the washed-out dawn, the hard planes of his face looked less like stone and more like exhaustion worn too long. After extraction, I woke up restrained. Questions before meds. Orders barked from men who knew my name, but not my team. Every touch after that meant take, not help. Needle, restraint, transport, signatures. Everyone said it was procedure. The word seemed to leave a bad taste in his mouth. Claire's hand paused on the rail of the bed. Metal cool under her palm. She lowered it instead of raising it, removing one more barrier from his line of sight. So you stopped letting anyone close enough to call it care, she said. This time he nodded without hesitation. If they can't touch you, they can't own the next thing they take. The truth of it sat in the room heavier than any machine. Claire drew a breath, then made her own move. She peeled off her gloves, dropped them into the waste bin with a soft snap, and picked up the small basin of warm water she had brought earlier and never used. Steam no longer rose from it, but it still held a trace of heat. She set it where he could see it, along with a clean washcloth folded square. Then choose it, she said. Not me. Not the hospital. You. He looked at the basin, then at her. She held his gaze and stepped back a full pace, giving him both space and the burden of decision. No one had done that before. Not tonight. Maybe not in years. His hand moved slowly, as if relearning permission. He took the cloth, dipped it, wrung it out, and passed it once over the back of his neck, where dried sweat still clung. The simple motion seemed to cost him more than the earlier confession. Claire waited. He handed the cloth back. Another choice. Another line crossed by his own will. She cleaned the dried blood from his forearm where the panic episode had reopened the wound hours earlier, the water cooling against his skin, the room so quiet that the faint drip in the 4-chamber sounded loud. When she finished, she reached for a fresh thermal blanket from the warmer cabinet. Warm air and the sterile scent of heated cotton escaped as she shook it open. You can put it on, he said. The words were plain. No strain. No defensive edge. Just permission. Claire laid the blanket over him, careful at his side, and tucked only the corner he watched her tuck. He exhaled, long and uneven, then let his head sink back into the pillow. The first real rest touched his face before sleep did. A soft knock came at the door not long after, followed by the attending physician's silhouette behind the narrow glass panel, clipboard in hand, waiting for the morning assessment. Hours earlier, the room would have detonated on contact. Claire turned toward the door. Before she could move, Ethan spoke into the quiet. 5 minutes, he said, not to her, but toward the glass, his voice rough and steady at once. Then he can come in. Claire looked back. He had not closed his eyes. He was looking at the door, at the shape of authority beyond it, and not recoiling. The doctor, hearing the answer through the barrier, lowered the clipboard slightly and stepped back without argument. Another thing changed in that instant. Not just that Ethan would allow care, but that he could now set the terms of it without turning the room into a battlefield. Claire returned to the bedside and checked the dressing one last time. Dry? Secure. His pulse strong under her fingers. You did that, she said. The dawn had fully reached the window by then, laying a thin band of silver across the floor and catching in the clear line of tubing beside the bed. Ethan followed that line with his eyes, as if tracing his way back into a world made of ordinary things. "No," he said after a moment, voice low, honest, and no longer barricaded. "You were the first person who made it possible." In the corridor, morning began with carts, shoes, distant pages, and the low mechanical hum of another shift taking over. But inside the inn suite, where a man had once turned every hand into a threat, one nurse had become the first touch he did not survive, but accept. And that was the moment he finally came back alive.